Hey y'all, it's Matt. We recorded this episode back in April of 2020 when everyone was quarantining and making bread to post on Instagram. Fast forward to now in June, American cities and cities around the world are joining in, protesting the systematic racism that has long been an issue in our societies. While our energy and focus turned to current events, editing this episode took a seat on the back burner. That said, we have it ready, but it couldn't be released at a worse time. Three white dudes talking about APIs while our friends in other communities are fighting injustices that have long kept them down seems to be a bit tone deaf, and we know that, we recognize that, and we commit ourselves to being more involved. There are a lot of conversations we want to have around this topic, both in the API world and outside of it as well. We don't want this episode to take away from the discussions going on around such important and heavy topics, but we do hope this can serve as a way for you to take a break while you travel to and from a protest. If you are going to protest, please stay safe, drink as much water as you can to stay hydrated in the heat, and know that things are changing for the better. To all the Black API developers out there, we see you, we're fighting with you, and we want you to know that we're listening. From all of us at APIs You Won't Hate, Black Lives Matter. All right, welcome to APIs You Won't Hate podcast, episode 7. I'm Matt, and I'm here, as always, with my good friend Phil. Phil, how's it going?
Hey, what's up?
And I think you're still locked down in England, is that correct? Or have you
That
moved?
is true. I'm still locked down on the farm with a whole pile of dogs.
God, that sounds lovely. How is that?
It's honestly not bad. I'm sorry to rub it in. It was a bit weird going from bikepacking through sleeping in my tent and just being in the middle of nowhere to panic lockdown mode. But we found a really nice spot and got a discount on it, and now I live on a farm, so it's fine.
That sounds pretty good, actually. And we're also joined by a very special guest, all the way from Montreal, Canada, Marc-Andre Giroux. You might know him online as a huge, I'm not going to say his Twitter handle because it's kind of complicated, but he is a huge GraphQL enthusiast, evangelist, all around, loves to talk about this topic. So we figured it'd be great to bring him to the Thunderdome. With Phil being across the ocean, we figured there's no violence involved today, but we are going to have a great discussion on what GraphQL is and why you should maybe consider it for your APIs. So Mark, how's it going?
Hey, how are you guys? I'm pretty good. I'm locked down in Montreal, Canada right now, in a condo in a city, so I really wish I was on a farm right now.
Yeah, so I mean, you're not completely locked down, Phil. You can walk around your grounds and everything, right?
Yeah, so the farm is 450 acres, so you can walk around it a fair bit. We've been taking the dogs for walks, and it takes an hour to get around the whole outside. And there's other farms that kind of join onto it, and with little stretches of woodland here and there. So yeah, we can walk a whole long time without seeing any other humans. And people have been shouting at me on the internet because I'll post these videos I'm cycling around country lanes and public footpaths and stuff, and people are stay the fuck home, and I'm there is literally no one here. I see more washing machines that have been abandoned than I see people when I go outside, so really not a concern.
Oh, that's hilarious. So Mark, where are you doing GraphQL right now?
Yeah, so I'm working at GitHub right now. I don't only do GraphQL. I'm on the API team there. We work on both our REST API and a GraphQL API. Before that, I was at Shopify. I also worked on their GraphQL API, and kind of on my own right now, just involved in the GraphQL community in general. So not only at work. So I mean, when you got started programming everything, obviously I don't think GraphQL was around back then, but what was the thing that kind of initially attracted you to GraphQL to make you kind of dig deeper into it and become kind of more of a subject matter expert on it? Yeah, it's almost kind of random. I stumbled up in GraphQL at some point, and I wrote a client, and I was like, that's pretty cool. And I started actually, I think I was playing with Relay, which is Facebook's kind of first GraphQL client that they released, and I started actually contributing back to this project. And I think that might have been one of the first projects I more seriously contributed to, and things kind of started from that, and slowly I was more and more involved until today, where I spend a lot of time on Twitter and the internet arguing and talking about GraphQL.
That's funny. I also spend a lot of time arguing on the internet. Not as much these days. Now I'm mostly a dev rail, so I'm trying to be positive on the internet. But it can be interesting to go out and have like a bunch of conversations with a bunch of different people that all have like super different views on stuff, because it can help you understand your thing a little bit better. I've had these conversations about APIs for a long time, and hearing people complain about how much they hate a certain thing helps me figure out how to improve tooling and documentation around that certain thing. So they start off kind of screaming at me, and these days I end up thanking them for giving me new insight. So it's a fun use of time.
That's very true. It's funny because in the end, when you talk long enough with these people, you realize like we kind of hate all the same things, and we all want the good things. So we're not all that different in the different kind of API communities. We just need to like figure out our contexts and how nuanced the particular contexts are usually.
Right. I mean, one of the things that I got talking to you about first, I think, was about kind of linting and automation and kind of style guidey stuff. Because I know that your team was building a kind of a spectral-like thing at GitHub, and you also built GraphQL Doctor. So we've been kind of sharing some ideas on that stuff, like basically the concept of convincing robots to do your bidding to kind of check your API descriptions, whatever format that happens to be in, whether it's GraphQL schema, JSON schema, or OpenAPI. So what have you been getting robots to do for you? Yeah,
so the goal here is ideally robots do as much as we can have do it. So a GraphQL Doctor, it does basically two things at the moment. On one end, it's kind of a breaking change detector. So it will let you know if the change you're making to our API description is a breaking one or not, which has really helped, especially with GraphQL kind of being newer. It's sometimes we have a lot of devs at GitHub kind of working on GraphQL, and not everybody is very well versed in what's a breaking change in GraphQL. And so that's been really helpful. And the other part is more of the linter, really similar to Spectral you've been working on. So kind of respecting our internal style guide as far as the GraphQL schema goes. And the goal of all of that is to API reviewer, like gatekeepers, is kind of annoying and doesn't scale very well. So ideally, everything that can be automated and done by a robot is. So that's GraphQL Doctor's role. And ideally, we'd have a lot more in there. Right now, it's kind of some basic rules, but I think we can push it really far where you need less and less of a human interaction. Of course, there's like higher level design stuff that will require human discussions, but yeah, these robots do a great job.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, we were talking about that a whole bunch on the last episode with Arno, the API kind of he wrote a book about API design and stuff like that. And yeah, we were talking about how at first, when you first get into kind of API design reviews and API governance or whatever you want to call it, you can spend a lot of time just kind of like, oh, you shouldn't use camel case. Why? I like camel case. Then you're just arguing about all this nonsense and it sucks, right? But then, if you start to automate more and more and more of that, then you can have fewer people doing more useful reviews because you can work on the higher level stuff instead of just mucking around on like, oh, that should be capitalized and that shouldn't.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's something like the programming community in general has like caught on to this a long time ago with tools like Rubocop and something. But yeah, it seems like in the API world, it's kind of more recent, but it's really great to see.
Just made me think about something. I mean, one of the biggest problems people have with things like Rubocop reminds me of a few conversations I've had recently about linting basically being useless. Like somebody at work said that linting was useless, and I was like, dude, we make a linter here. But I think they were talking about things like when somebody at the company adds 1,000 rules to Rubocop and everyone has to spend the next week battling through a bunch of errors, complaining about where they put their semicolon, right? So stuff like that might not be all that helpful, but a well-programmed linter can kind of catch a whole bunch of problems, especially when you're describing like an API design linter. It can help catch errors in your API design before you build that API and put it in production and have clients relying on it. So that seems a little bit more important than some of these other things that people hate. So I was just wondering if you have any examples of some rules that you've programmed into one of these robots that you're particularly proud of, maybe?
Yeah, for sure. One example of a rule that's been really helpful is we have a rule on certain fields, certain arguments, on some GraphQL fields where if you don't provide a default value for them, the linter is going to yell at you and say, please actually set a default value here to, instead of like letting clients guess what the default behavior when you don't pass that optional argument, we always have default value there, which without a robot, like every time an API reviewer needs to remind people of that rule, probably this person forgets too. So yeah, that's been really helpful. And you're absolutely right that, and the other thing with APIs is once they're out there, sometimes they're much harder to change than a semicolon in code. So that makes them so much more important to my eyes, where you really want to get things right before they're out there to like hundreds of thousands of clients.
So I want to go back for a second to what you kind of said at the start, which is we all kind of hate the same things. And I'll admit I'm very much in the REST camp. How would you sell me on GraphQL? How would you really present GraphQL to somebody who is ardently against trying it or trying new things, or thinks that like REST is the end all be all of everything?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't try, I think, but I understand your question. I think, first of all, there are certain things. I think people who really love REST I think, were kind of a bit angry at first because people wanted to apply GraphQL to everything, and obviously that's not the answer to everything. But I do think RPC in general and other API styles have a lot of value. So to me, there's two things that make GraphQL great. One is inherent to GraphQL, where first of all, you have this the ability for a schema to represent possibilities, which clients can consume in many different ways without affecting the server team to provide these new use cases. So like, for example, creating a new BFF or creating a new compound document endpoint for this particular client. It kind of lets server define a schema where, supporting like many known clients is useful. The problem is that sometimes this get abused. Like, for example, what I just said kind of sounds like GraphQL would be a great fit for a public API, but I do think it also makes it hard because when you don't know who your clients are going to be, you don't exactly know their precise use cases. So sometimes something more generic like REST might actually scale way more to this kind of scale. But when you actually have like a set of known clients, a large one maybe, but a known set of clients where you need to support use cases and your clients can tell you their use cases, I think that query language, and especially the fact there's no select star, so like all leaves fields are selected, so you know, like by looking at a query exactly what a client is interested in, makes things really easy for a server provider. So that's kind of what's inherent to GraphQL. And then the other kind of, it's almost luck to me, but where GraphQL like bundles in a bunch of practices together where, for example, the schema, the great tooling, that kind of like all came together with a great community, which makes it a great choice, not because like GraphQL is inherently good at that, because you can have a schema with many other APIs, but like all that bundled in made like a really good ecosystem with good enough like tooling and a schema and everything. So not sure if that makes sense, but yeah.
No, that absolutely makes sense. I mean, the everything kind of being bundled together is one of the biggest selling points for it. Like I still recommend GraphQL to people that just absolutely don't have the time to sit around figuring out which data format to use, which schema format to use, which you know, a bunch of these different standards. You can plug and play a bunch of them. And if they have no idea what HTOS is, then what's the point in even pretending that you're building a REST API? So sometimes they just say, like, if you don't want to have to think about any of this stuff, just go and use GraphQL. But yeah, I've been kind of taking doing it things the hard way for a little while, which is trying to get all the formats to play together really nicely. And that's like going through so many different standards bodies and all this different stuff. Like the recent win is getting JSON schema and OpenAPI to play together properly, right? That took like a year and a half. And then JSON API, the actual message format, which has hypermedia stuff, they're now integrating with OpenAPI and JSON schema to say like, hey, we're describing, JSON API describes the shape of the actual data. It tells you how you should format the message. But if you'd like to say what is in this message, then you should go and use JSON schema and OpenAPI. So yeah, when you have one group of people that's just saying, we're going to do everything and we're going to give it a nice website and we're going to document all of it together, it doesn't matter if it's better or worse. For some people, it's just nice to have it all in one place. Whereas the like open source kind of standards interoperability approach has been like, let's spend 2 years agreeing to align and all integrate, but we're actually kind of there now. So it's been tricky. It's been a rocky road, but I feel like we're starting to slowly get towards this similar sort of situation in the REST community where it does kind of all work together,
Yeah, absolutely. I think everything around OpenAPI has been making this easier and easier. Although I'll tell you, I've been like working on OpenAPI stuff in Ruby, and it's not fun so far. There's lacking support for some of that stuff in certain ecosystem. The stuff Stoplight's been working on is great in TypeScript and JavaScript. So when you have the chance, that's great. But certain ecosystem like Ruby, GraphQL tooling is, I think, really better than the OpenAPI or even JSON schema, which is the older versions are great, but more recent versions are just inexistent in Ruby right now.
Right. I do find that funny. Like certain languages just seem to nail support. Like it seems like there's a lot of different factors that go into it, but maybe in a certain language, there are certain frameworks or certain people or certain projects that prefer GraphQL or REST, and therefore the tooling is just much better around one than the other. Because in the JavaScript and TypeScript communities and PHP, there's a lot of people that seem to love JSON schema and OpenAPI and have built amazing tooling for it. But in Ruby, as you brought up, like the tooling really isn't good. And I know some of the people that work on some of those tools, and it's kind of unfortunate that it's not that good, but it's one of those awkward situations where it's death by 1,000 clones. I've talked about this sort of stuff before on the podcast, but when you have like 10 tools that all do the same thing, but they don't do it very well, and all of those developers are just, busy and they'd love to make it better, but they don't have that much time, but they're all still a little bit too proud to like fold into a different project. You know what I mean? I feel like GraphQL often has like a de facto standard. Like there will be the package in Ruby or whatever, and people will all kind of contribute to that one. And then in other, in like the REST ecosystem or just the HTTP API ecosystem, you often have a lot of separate siloed efforts where people are working on their own thing, and then they kind of get a bit tired or a bit bored, or they don't have time to make it look good, or they don't have time to make docs so no one knows that it's any good. And you just get a lot of people spinning their wheels. But overall, there is more effort being put into the REST ecosystem. They're just doing it in their own little silos sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so weird. I don't know if it's just like random luck or, for example, the Golang community around GraphQL has like more of that clone problem. I find there's like many ways of doing it and different maintainers. But yeah, the other thing I'm wondering is OpenAPI has a bit more of an enterprisey vibe to it than GraphQL, and the Ruby community generally is not, let's say, aligned with that as much. So I wonder if that plays a factor. I don't know really, but it's definitely interesting.
Well, anyway, that was a slight tangent. Let's get back to our very, very strict script that we've all agreed now. I'm just kidding. So there's a bunch. So one of the things I've really appreciated about a lot of your articles and blogs and just tweets in general and just your talks is that one of the things that frustrates me about GraphQL fans often is what you mentioned earlier of just people that want to use it for everything all the time and completely ignore all other context. It's just the blind zealot kind of approach. But you always write in a much more reasoned and balanced way, right? It's more objective. Could you just maybe talk a little bit about why people think GraphQL is versionless and what kind of problems that can cause for people, but what the actual benefits of evolution are?
Yep, absolutely. So it all comes from so if you go on, I think GraphQL.org right now, you'll see evolve your API without versions. And they're talking about basically just using like continuous evolution of the API, which I think not the whole, but some of the API community in general would agree on. Like you don't always need hard like URL versioning or global versioning. But a lot of people take a statement really seriously and think there's just like no need of evolution in general and that they're free of all breaking changes. So yeah, this one tweet I saw this week where someone was surprised the API broke a client when they removed the field. And someone in the comments was like, hey, I thought GraphQL was versionless. Like, why did that break your API? So there's a bit of confusion there. But I do think GraphQL does have a lot of things built in that make it great to adopt kind of an evolution in place approach rather than versioning, like a global versioning. The first part of it is the thing I was talking about before. There's no like select star. So if I'm opting for additive changes and backward compatible changes, I'm not adding any bloat. That's something like you hear a lot of people complain about of continuous evolution is like the bloat you add with all these additive changes. But with GraphQL, you don't add any of that to existing clients because they're already selecting the subset of fields that we're interested in. And the other thing is just there's a deprecated directive on fields and enum values and soon on arguments. That's just built in GraphQL. So there's that in OpenAPI, but I think in general with HTTP-based APIs, deprecations were not as in any spec. Like right now, there's the sunset header, there's a deprecation header coming, which is great. But GraphQL just makes it clear that you can use the deprecated directive to do that. So that's kind of like the spec where you've got everything bundled in I was talking about. Like, so it guides you towards continuous evolution. But of course, it doesn't mean you can just remove stuff and expect clients to work.
So that's interesting because just today you were talking about GraphQL and evolution has kind of been like the primary versioning guidelines that GraphQL has handled. But is there any kind of different versioning approaches out there that you've seen maybe in the wild, or is versioning or evolution kind of been the default versioning schema that GraphQL as a whole has kind of fallen under?
Almost everyone's using kind of that evolution approach, except recently Shopify announced they were versioning their GraphQL API, kind of similar to Stripe with that date-based versioning, except it's in the URL for them, I think. Mm-hmm. You can do some pretty cool stuff with GraphQL and that approach, because you can kind of use like visibility filters on your fields where you like present a different version of the graph depending on your version or a header you pass. And you can even, I've heard of some people making transforms of like if client is sending a deprecated field, you have some kind of middleware to transform this field into what it should be named now. So on the server side, you kind of write this little transform, but you don't need to maintain the old fields. So you've got kind of these cool strategies, but almost like 99% of things I've seen is continuous evolution so far.
Nice. I mean, that's cool that everyone's kind of coalesced around one thing, kind of what seems to be early in the whole GraphQL lifecycle versus like the HTTP community. If you just watch Phil's Twitter on any given day, we're going to be battling over how to properly version your APIs. Is there any kind of like when you're designing a schema that will evolve, is there anything that you really need to consider that up front as you're designing it? Like any kind of hot tips for people that may or may not come back and bite them in the ass like a year down the road?
Yeah, for sure. The worst thing is naming. The worst thing I've seen is like you name something super generic, like probably user is the best example. Almost like all APIs that evolve have more than one version of a user or like concept behind a user. And when you name like user right away and everything's named user, it's really hard to evolve further. So one tip I often give is like being overly specific with everything. It's like, are we dealing with an Instagram user versus just a regular user, or is that a Google Plus user, whatever? Being super specific really helps you like understand your domain more as you're building, and then like when you have a better idea, you can kind of like use those more generic names when the domain makes more sense. So that's one. The other one, especially for GraphQL, but really everything, is not being afraid of representing things as more complex objects instead of scalars. So like instead of saying the price is an integer, well, maybe like even if you just have an integer in mind, like wrap that into an object so you can eventually add like currency you didn't think about, like formats, formatted fields. So these are the two biggest things in my mind.
Nice. I mean, I think those are both really good tips going out. Why don't you think there are many public GraphQL APIs right now? Is it just because GraphQL is so kind of in its infancy and maturing, or maybe another reason? I'm not exactly sure, but I'm curious here.
Yeah, I think there's many reasons. The first one being clearly GraphQL was never intended as a public API strategy, right? It comes out of Facebook's use case first, although it has evolved a little bit, but when they released it, even GraphQL was very coupled to the relay client, which meant your server had to expose certain types to even work with a relay client. So that kind of screams internal to me because it had to work with their internal client. I think it's gotten better since, but I do think it has this history. The other thing is what I was talking about earlier, where GraphQL is great when you control the client and when you know your client use cases so you can expose them. But a lot of public APIs, their strategy is more like we'll expose concepts and we look forward to see what people are going to innovate with, or really like tell us what kind of use case you can achieve with that. And GraphQL maybe shines a bit less about like just exposing generic resources that people can use in whatever way they want. And really it shines when you can expose very, very client-specific use cases. And it's really good at exposing multiple of those use cases, but you probably don't want to expose just like resources, very like data-focused resources, which I think REST does definitely a better job at. So, yeah.
Yeah, there's a tricky balance with that as well, though. I mean, one of the most common problems that happens in the REST community seems to be people making their APIs too data focused and not asking questions about those user stories, right? Like, I had someone asked me the question the other day, like, what do you do when something might succeed in a business way or fail in a technical way? Like what happens if a technical process succeeds but a business one doesn't in your API? I'm like, wait, why are they two different things, right? So people kind of they will make an API that is very, very data generic, and it's just a data store over the wire, and then it won't actually solve the business needs because the business has to make 25 different, the client has to make a bunch of different requests to try and figure out if something worked or not. They'll say like, trying to make a payment. Well, the payment was recorded in the database, so we'll consider that a success, but we have to go somewhere else to find out if the payment actually was sent. So that doesn't sound like a very useful payment API. And I feel like that's the key to making any API, whether you're building a REST-ish one or a GraphQL one or full-on HTOS, is doing a big old survey of what your users are actually trying to do, and then making sure your API actually solves that problem, instead of like building a very well normalized API that matches your database schema, because that's also very well normalized, and then just going, there you go, figure it out. And having a bunch of users then complain that it doesn't solve their needs. And you're like, all right, well, we'll try and take care of that in version 2. And that's where you end up with global versioning, because you have to keep constantly changing everything based on feedback that your API doesn't work because you never planned it very well in the first place. So I've enjoyed listening to a lot of talks about people from the GraphQL community who talk about that like it's a feature of GraphQL, but really it's just, for some reason, people seem to consider design before they actually build their API in GraphQL land. And that maybe has been less true in the REST community until recently. Do you notice any difference over there about, like in GraphQL land, between code first and design first?
Yep. So this one is a subject I love, and I know you've been talking a lot about it too. There's the GraphQL design first, SDL first versus code first debate, and then there's the API design first versus code first debate that are a bit different to me. So the GraphQL debate is more generally about frameworks and how they allow you to build a GraphQL schema. So certain of them you'll basically write the SDL, which is the schema language for GraphQL, and then you'll write some functions that you then need to map with the schema so that you can actually resolve data at runtime. And then you'll have other frameworks that will let you build that schema in code and have methods like collocated with that schema to resolve these fields. And generally, I'm in the opinion that the code first approach to building a schema in GraphQL is better because, first of all, the SDL, the schema language in GraphQL is not as complete as, let's say, OpenAPI, right? It doesn't have examples, or it's not as fine-grained as OpenAPI. You don't have validations in there or anything. And you can't do really complex things. So people will abuse what is called directives on a GraphQL schema to kind of achieve things that should be done in code. So it's kind of like the whole YAML versus code debate. Like, you might as well use a programming language to do some of this more complex stuff. So that's kind of where the debate is in the GraphQL world. But I think you can actually be design first, but code first to implement that design, if that makes sense. So I don't know if I know you've been very vocal about this. And I think that's something we mix up sometimes, like the design first versus spec first. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, you can design something before you build it without using an API description format, right? Like that. But that just generally doesn't happen in the REST community, in the HTTP community. Like it's like a theoretical argument versus what people actually do, you know?
Right.
I pointed out, like I wrote an article about it fairly recently, kind of beyond, after we did the code first, design first one. It was like annotations and DSLs and code frameworks that poop out specs versus code frameworks that read in specs and things like that. And yeah, like you could do a design first API using annotations in code, right? And you could build these empty Java controllers or PHP controllers or whatever you want to build with these empty models, and you could just add in all these annotations, pretending that there were properties in there. And you could add all of these theoretical doc blocks that would explain what those properties would do if they existed. And yeah, you could do a bunch of user surveys to find out what people wanted to do, and then you could use that annotation kind of framework to build a fake API before it actually exists, and then that still would technically be design first. But yeah, people don't generally bother doing that all that much. So the way that the design first but actually code first thing probably more usually works is surveys, prototype, alpha, pilot group, another prototype. You know, you code another prototype. And then you kind of go back in this cycle of, user feedback, write more code, user feedback, write more code. And so if you're in that flow, that really is design first. You're doing it via code as the mechanism for delivering these prototypes. But you're still kind of taking all of the philosophical ideas from design first of getting your clients involved really early on, and then like using their feedback to drive how the API works, instead of just plopping out a data store that runs over the wire.
Yeah, absolutely. I think your post said it well. The main difference here I find is the feedback loop is a bit longer if you go code first, because usually you'll have like a generation step where you like generate the spec the description document from code, and then you'll run like contract tests or anything. So I do think there's value in a SDL or spec first approach in terms of that feedback loop. But then again, it's so context dependent on the organization, like trying to convince hundreds of Rails developers to write YAML instead of like active record style classes, for example. Sometimes it's hard. So
for sure,
it really depends on your environment.
You were working, one of the first things we started talking about a long time ago now, I think, was you were interested in trying to see if hypermedia or Hateos could be squeezed into GraphQL at all, right? Because I'd been talking about how REST is often kind of confused with HTTP, JSON over HTTP. And that's not really what it's about. It's about being a state machine where you can combine a whole bunch of data with a bunch of available actions to get that resource to various different states, right? You have a invoice that's payable. So you follow the pay action and then you have paid the invoice. And GraphQL kind of out of the box doesn't really do that, right? Like it's a bit of a different thing. It's a different use case for it. But you were looking into you're doing an experiment to try and see if you could do that in hypermedia. First off, I'm sure there'll be some people wondering why the hell would you do that? And secondly, like how did that experiment go?
Yeah, so as you said, it was basically just a thought experiment. I was trying to see if I could. It's that state machine you were talking about. With GraphQL, you have mutations which are essentially just RPC calls, and kind of returning that kind of state machine where you're saying like, is your cart valid to proceed to a checkout? Can you pay for this checkout? Is it paid? You can't do it in the same way as hypermedia, let's say. So I wanted to include some kind of special, maybe like actions field, kind of like siren style, where maybe you could like query, if this scenario happens, you could query this action for next thing. But the problem here, it kind of quickly came to a stop because since GraphQL is so client driven, clients would need to provide what queries they want to run on these actions. So instead of like following a link, well, it'd be more like saying, hey, like I want to run this query if we're in that state, which is kind of hard to do. So it kind of, I don't know if it's possible, let's say.
I mean, I'm not as up to date on hypermedia and stuff, so I'm going to pivot right on back to the GraphQL stuff, because you've been also talking about BFFs, talking about like a lot of people were talking about like one graph to rule them all, and it's not really been working out too well. Can you kind of dive in for a minute and kind of talk about like what are people actually trying to do with this, and where are they going wrong, and kind of like what is the potential solution there?
Yeah, so when people read about GraphQL, and generally when companies adopt GraphQL, they're really interested about that idea where your whole domain is within one graph. And even like companies who have like different divisions, like you can query across like really like a huge domain, which, I mean, GraphQL does that, which is nice. It does help like querying what you could compare to like compound documents, which is can be really helpful. But I always wonder if there's like, sometimes companies try to go too far and like really expose everything as one graph is really that helpful. So for example, when you have like different subdomains that don't really need to talk to each other, I think there's more value in decoupling that into different APIs than necessarily like putting that under one graph. And I think the other reason people are so interested in that is, so Apollo is one big vendor in the GraphQL space, and they released what I think is called Principled GraphQL. It's a web page with like principle you should follow in GraphQL, and one of them is you should have one graph. And I think generally it's a good, I mean, you wouldn't expose like small like GraphQL endpoints, or else you wouldn't be doing GraphQL. But I do think there's a limit to how big one graph you want to get, if that makes sense. And I think it kind of like follows the idea of like BFFs here, where people often compare GraphQL to BFF, and I did even in some posts. But there's a big difference here where yes, GraphQL allows different clients to query the schema in different ways, but BFFs are more than just that. They're also like infrastructurally different things. Maybe you have different middlewares in front of them. So that's something, I feel that's a risk with GraphQL, where you're like, if you're centralizing everything, you don't exactly have all the benefits of the BFF approach. You only have like the representation benefits of like supporting many clients.
That's a funny thing that I've heard come up a lot at WeWork and kind of in consulting since, is that people kind of confuse GraphQL with a BFF. And what I mean by that is they'll often describe why. I mean, people literally hire me as a consultant to come into their company and help them decide if they should use GraphQL or REST or something else, right? So like, I feel like these blog posts and these kind of ongoing arguments have just turned into a bit of a job. But a lot of the time they'll list off a bunch of reasons why they specifically want to use GraphQL. And I would just be like, you're describing a BFF. This could be written in any paradigm. Like your main concerns at the moment sound like you just need a BFF. Like they'll talk about, that we have this API that keeps changing and it's very expensive. So we want to just, control things ourselves and just talk to this one API that we control. Like, yep, that's a BFF. But another one of the big drivers that I hear equally often is people talking about GraphQL being very standard, right? Like you have this one standard interface to interact with, when all of the other APIs in their ecosystem are all totally different. And when they say that, my usual response is, well, why are all of your APIs totally different? And that's when my kind of standardization thought process kind of kicks in. It's like, well, it sounds like somebody should have been using a style guide and there should be, some API governance going on. And if you have 25 different ways of authenticating different APIs, you could probably use an API gateway system to make that more standard itself. So sometimes when I hear these arguments of, we need to use GraphQL to make this one graph to rule them all, or I hear several different client teams suggesting that they should build a BFF so that they can then standardize larger swaths of the ecosystem. Well, that sounds like multiple client teams are trying to standardize an entire API ecosystem that should probably bloody well standardize itself a little bit. What do you think about that? Where does the buck stop? Like how many clients should be trying to standardize the backends?
Yeah, I mean, you said it right. That GraphQL almost seems like a band-aid to this problem for some teams. They're like, well, we can't standardize. Like all our APIs are returning like different stuff. So we'll have one graph and everything's going to be standardized. But then if you couldn't standardize that, you'll just have other standard problems. Like all your different fields are going to be named differently. Like at some point you need to invest into standards and linters, as we said, and good like API quality workflows. And that's a problem if you're writing gRPC, if you're writing GraphQL or REST. You just need to get your shit together, really. So the other thing is, while the BFF, you have like your clients have their own like little servers. It's like kind of a cultural thing where like they own that part. With GraphQL, well, it's yes and no, right? Because like it's still, the representations or the schema is still driven by a GraphQL server. So clients still need to add their fields in. And if the field already exists and used by another service, then you need a standard. Like, do clients add new versions of their fields with their like client as a namespace, for example? There's like possibility of clashes. So I think GraphQL doesn't solve that at all. It's maybe like an opportunity to start over for some people. But really, you gotta get your shit together no matter what API style you use.
So last thing I think we all kind of want to talk about, Phil brought up your book, Production Ready GraphQL. How has that been writing? Is this your first book that you've written?
Yeah, it's the first book ever. It was way more work than I thought, that's for sure.
Well, I mean, like, what is the process to writing a book like that? Did you pitch your idea out there, or did someone approach you to kind of get going on it?
Not even. I was writing tons of blog posts, and I was like, I might as well write a book. So it took about 2 years, because every time I was writing something, I was so excited to put it out there that I'd just like make a blog post out of it. So eventually, like, I was accumulating content, and really, I wrote the majority of the book in the last like 6 months or so, when I actually had a release date. So yeah, the book started initially. I think it was named like the Little Book of GraphQL Schema Design. I wanted it to be like a little booklet on like designing good APIs. And then I scope crept it, and I wrote like this entire book on like building GraphQL servers. So yeah, it takes time. Phil, you've got a book out there too coming, a second one, I think.
Yeah, quite like you, I kind of write a lot of blog posts, and then the plan was to kind of pull those all together and turn it into a book. But a lot of the blog posts I've been doing recently aren't quite so definitive. Like the first book was written in that exact same way. I literally wrote a blog post about, pagination, and then, oh great, now I've got a chapter on pagination sorted. But a lot of the articles I've done recently are a bit more like code first, design first. That makes for a good chapter. But then in GraphQL versus REST or whatever, those sorts of things can make for good design chapters. But I wanted to do build APIs you won't hate too. And I've so far written an entire like part of the book just about design stuff. And I feel like it might need to become design APIs you won't hate, and just really focus on the design part and how and when and what formats you use. Because yeah, I think I might have set my sights a little bit too high. I mean, you set your sights a little bit low and then expanded them, which I thought was quite a nice way of doing it. You were just going to talk about the evolvable schemas or like schema design, and then went, no, I could do some other parts. I could do some other parts too. Whereas I just went, I could do everything about APIs ever. Oh wait, that's a lot.
Yeah, definitely finding the right scope for a book is not easy. But yeah, I'm really happy. Finished it. Like I shipped it 2 weeks ago now, and it's good reception. I'm pretty happy.
Yeah, I mean, beyond tweeting about it, how do you get folks interested in the book? Where have you been going on a book tour? Are you sitting in the local bookshop signing them?
No. mainly it's the blog posts I've been writing for years now, like kind of accumulated this small audience of GraphQL people. Haven't done a lot of like heavy marketing really, but it's been doing great. Yeah.
So where online can people find your book? Is it self-published, or can they find it on like a big box retailer?
Yeah, it's entirely self-published, so I sell it on my own Shopify. People can get it on book.productionreadygraphql.com.
Nice, awesome. And then, so should people already be expecting like a follow-up book in 2 years as GraphQL matures? Is there any plans down the road, or?
I'm already like kind of writing new sections as we speak. Just there's always like new stuff, and I have this Slack community when you buy a kind of like the premium version of the book, and people have been giving like tons of good feedback, and people have good questions. So it's kind of like continuous like new content to write, which is great.
Awesome, cool. Is there anything else you want to give a shout out to? I know your Twitter. You want to throw out your Twitter handle for people?
Actually, in a show notes is perfect because it's really hard to say.
It's your last name backwards, isn't it?
It's my last name backwards, yep.
I just put that together.
I had not figured that one out before. I am not smart.
It was the biggest mistake ever.
I had the Google Drive or Google Doc open, and it has Giroux, and I was like, wait a second, it's X-U-O. So you can find him on Twitter. You can find him in the APIs You Won't Hate Slack as well, although apparently you're not in the GraphQL channel, which I think...
Yeah, I just joined that. It's not very popular, I see.
I think that's because Phil shouts at everybody.
While you were discussing that, I just typed out my own surname backwards, and it's Nogrutz. I'm not going to make that my handle. That's hilarious. Well, yeah, so we're all on the APIs You Won't Hate Slack channel, which you can all get to on slack.apisuwon'thate.com. Swing by. There's a bunch of us on there, and we talk about all sorts of things, GraphQL, gRPC, whatever you want. And it's started to become free consulting. So my consulting is taking a hit, but that's fine because we're all learning. Yeah, this has been really fun talking to you. Let's call it a day. Yeah, I'll see you all on the internet.
Cool. Awesome. Thank you so much, Mark. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, guys. See ya.